It's tea and it's French and all about France. So let me begin by saying bonjour. And let me begin by saying that the tea that I'm drinking today, it's an exotic blend of black tea, jaggery made out of dates and real dates. So this is a fantastic aromatic blend that I'm trying today, and I'm blown away about it. So it since it is France and tea. Bonjour, once again. Let me just begin by saying that the French has been drinking tea much before the English took up tea and went completely gaga and crazy about it. Last Sunday we were talking about how crazy the English were about tea that they ended up um, creating the opium war. Yeah, but today we are going to talk about France. Uh, and they are neighbors, not very friendly neighbors, but neighbors. The animosity or the competition, to be put in better ways, between England and France has been legendary. And so it's been interesting to see that French took up drinking tea at least 22 years before the English did. In fact, tea arrived in Paris in 1632, and that is exactly 22 years until tea arrived in London. So French, started drinking tea before English, though the first people who started drinking tea in Europe were the Dutch. The Dutch were the first people to start sailing from Europe towards the Orient, which they used to call East Indies, and they landed up in China and they started getting tea, and uh, the rest is history. So tea was, when it arrived in 1632, tea slowly became the drink of the royal people, the noblemen, the kings, and things like that. It started off as a medicinal beverage, but around 1639, Cardinal Mazarin was the most powerful man in France under the King Louis the 16th. So Cardinal Mazarin started consuming tea, and as the most powerful person who started drinking tea, it also inspired and influenced many people around him to start drinking tea. The major reason that he started drinking tea, because he thought that his gout problem would be taken care of by tea. So he used to drink lot and lot of cups of tea. But eventually, of course, he fell in love with tea, and he started drinking lot of tea. So inspired by him, it was very quickly adopted by the wealthy people, because tea was, it's a very important, what do I say, expensive imported material that was coming from China. It's only the rich people could afford it. So it became a drink of the wealthy people who had a lot of money to spare, and it was slowly introduced into the French courts. So and around 1665 is when King Louis the 16th also learnt about tea and its goodness, and he also learnt that uh, people in China and Japan, where this tea grows, there are hardly any heart problems for people. So he decided that he needs to drink this tea. One is that Cardinal Mazarin was already drinking tea for health reasons, and so he decided that if that this is such a phenomenal drink which can give you such good health benefits, he started drinking tea like crazy. So he also adopted the tea in his life, and so did his wife, the very famous uh, Marie Antoinette, or as we call her in English, Mary Antoinette. So she also adopted the tea. In fact, the bourgeois class, which Karl Marx, later on defined as the people who actually had all the manufacturing and industries with them and controlled the goods and supplies in the society. Typically they were the higher middle class people, not really the royalty or the noble class. The bourgeois also were so enamored by the tea, it became part of their daily life. Yeah, but it was still not, it was never a tea of the lower classes, the poor people, like unlike in England, when tea came and slowly it from the royal people, it actually spread over to entire population of English people, irrespective of their class or nobility. It never happened in France. So it was always the drink of the elite people. It always remained the drink of the elite people. Now there was this very famous lady called the Madame de Sévigné, and she is very well known for her gossip letters. So she used to be a regular in the French courts, and she would write very witty, funny gossip letters for her daughter, and she would explain everything that she would see in her when in her interactions in the court, and she would then write those things in her letter in a very funny witty way for her daughter who was back at home. So in many of her letters she would talk about Princess de Terente was another noble woman, but she was also the lady in waiting for Mary Antoinette. So she, it seems, was drinking 12 cups of tea in a day because she believed that this was giving her good health. So this is found from one of the gossip letters that Madame de Sevigny had written for her daughter. So there are lots of this kind of anecdotes which shows that tea was a part of the royalty, the nobility, and things like that. Now, besides King Louis the 16th and his wife Marie Antoinette, there is another very famous person in France who was just starting to, raise in status, and he is none other than Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, Napoleon Bonaparte, as you know, was actually an Italian, and he grew up in the city of in the place called Corsica, right? And and he became the emperor of France after the French Revolution. I'll come back to the story of French Revolution a little bit, but I'm putting him in perspective. So when he became the emperor of France, he became the emperor of France between 1804, and he was the emperor of France until 1814, and then again in 1815. So the French Revolution had started in 1789, and it ended in 1799. So it lasted 10 years, right? So after that, Napoleon became the emperor. He is self-proclaimed emperor, as you know, and he is a very, very famous and important French nobleman who became the emperor, who was known for his true blue love for tea. Now, there's a very famous letter that he wrote to his wife Josephine, and Josephine was Napoleon's first wife, as you know, and she was like about 5 6 years older than him, and Napoleon was madly and deeply in love with Josephine. And after their marriage, when Napoleon had to go to the war, um, and he was away from his beloved wife, he would love, he would write very passionate love letters to Josephine. And in one of the letters, he writes, "I can't have a cup of tea without cursing the glory and the ambition which keep me away from the love of my life." So this is a very famous quote, or from one of the letters that he wrote to his wife Josephine. And not only that, he is known for carrying his very exquisite sets of tea uh, cups, porcelains, and accessories everywhere he traveled because of war. In fact, after the Waterloo war, where he was defeated, uh, his samovar was captured. They found his samovar, and they took the samovar away. And he had spent huge amount of money in designing customized tea cups and accessories for himself and everybody that he loved, particularly for Josephine and a lot of other noble people or friends that he had. He has created, curated, and designed some fantastic tea accessories. So if you go to the Google and search Napoleon tea accessories, you will see the designs, and you will see those teapots, which are now sitting in some museum in France and England. So so these are the two different people in France, sets of people. One is the king, who lost his kingdom after the during the French Revolution, and Napoleon, who grew up during the French Revolution. He was only 26-year-old when he joined the French Revolution, coming from the French army, and he married Josephine, who was around 31 years old at that time. And then he went on to become the most powerful man in France, and his mad love for his wife and tea. Now, what happened during the French Revolution? So, as I was saying, that in France, the tea never went down, trickled down to the mass of the people. Now, France was going through, I'm not getting into the whole story of French Revolution. I'm sure, all of you know about it. If you do not know, there's a lot of resources available in Google, and if you want to hear, listen to it, they're all also on YouTube. So during the this thing, when the French Revolution was brewing, I mean, people were still not thinking about it as revolution, but more as a protest against the mismanagement of the country, because French had almost become bankrupt at certain point of time because of their very ill-fought wars with Britain, as well as their help. They were helping the Americans to win their battle of independence against British. So they had actually run out of money, completely run out of money. And they were followed by 2 3 years of no rain and droughts and stuff like that. So the farmers and the lower middle class people, the people who are really hardworking, who are really feeding the country, were in very very bad state. And unfortunately, the kings and the rich and the wealthy people, they had absolutely no empathy or no understanding about what was happening at the ground level. And instead of helping out these poor people, these farmers, the only solution that they found was to impose tax after tax after tax. So there's a very funny video in YouTube where you see that the kind of tax they would levy on poor people. It's like, even if you have salt for your food, you have to pay a tax on that. So it was so ridiculous that people were going the poor people who were really feeding were really, really, without food. They were starving, while the rich people had absolutely no understanding, and they were partying hard and living a good life, and absolutely no empathy or care and stuff like that. So people got really upset with the whole situation. And if you look at the population of France at that time, the 98% of the population were these poor people, and only this 2% of the population were these rich people. And in spite of that, this 2% of the people were managing this 98% of the people, and they felt entitled to squeeze this 98% of the people and take away everything so that they can have a good life. This is very famously when uh, King Louis the 16th was said that these are the hungry people and they are mad at you, that's why they have come to your court. He used to run his court from Seville, and he said, okay, then why don't they eat a cake? So this was the amount of ignorance or no humanity for the poor people. And of course that created this whole revolution. It was one of the bloodiest and very extremely cruel, and a lot of people lost their life. But when, and in the process, when very famously it is said that in 1789, when these people who were running this movement went on and captured the jail to gather the guns and the bullets, for cartridges for that. And that was the beginning of French Revolution. And by 1799, when it ended with the death of Louis the 16th and Mary Antoinette. Their heads were cut, as you know, by guillotine. And guillotine was something, guillotine, it's called. It was something that was introduced in 1791, and it was also introduced as a mean to punish people irrespective of their class. So whether it's a king or a poor farmer or a petty thief, previously the death penalties or penalties were different. Now this was introduced to actually democratize the death penalty or penalty for everybody. So the king, the queen, and a lot of people lost their life. Their head were severed with this process. And with that, tea was completely abandoned. And I mean, tea was completely thrown away from their life, uh, as a symbol of aristocracy, as a symbol of nobility, as a symbol for wealthy people's drink, the bourgeois class drink. So tea became, um also tea represented something that the English was drinking now more and more. So this whole hatred for these rich people in France and their drink, which was tea, as well as their arch enemy, the English people drinking tea, tea was actually thrown out of their life. And the common people of France, after the revolution, they took to coffee like anything. That's how coffee became so popular. Cafe and baristas and etc. became very, very popular in France after that, because they thought anything that French Revolution has cleaned us of everything that was to do with wealth, richness, wealthy people. And so tea is not something that we are going to touch. Uh, but of course, Napoleon was still drinking tea. Um, as I said, he was taking his whole course of things. So, uh, for 50 years in France, there was no tea that people were, drinking as a choice of their drink. But after 50 years, slowly the tea culture had revived, not of course to the level of coffee drinking or the wine drinking that they have, but slowly after 50 years it had revived. and they took to tea drinking in a completely different way than how the English were drinking tea. But that is a very different story, and that story is for another day. How did that happen? How did the first tea company was formed in in Paris 50 years after the French Revolution, and that they are still existing, and they are one of the most well known and respected tea brands in France. They have almost 200 tea blends in their list of tea products. So that's a story for another day, but today's story ends here with how tea became uh, a drink that nobody wanted to touch after French Revolution and coffee took over, while Napoleon was still drinking tea. Whenever he went for his war, he carried his entire tea collection, and then it ended with him when he died, when he was captured and he was killed. And that's the story of France and tea. Yes, so any questions, I would be very happy to. So going back to my tea, thank you, Deepa, thank you for joining. Tea has some very interesting stories coming from everywhere in the world. In fact, do you know that when the English people started drinking tea, they were drinking green tea, and since they had no idea about how a tea should be taken, they were mixing milk and sugar in that. They were drinking green tea with milk and sugar, because milk, sugar, and tea, all three of this product, meant that they were rich people. Because sugar was being imported from Latin America, tea was coming from China, and milk could only be afforded by the rich. Hi Pritham. So that's the story. Of course, they slowly learn to drink uh, black tea, but their love for drinking uh, tea with milk and sugar still exists, and that is another thing that the French people decided never to do. They do not drink tea with milk and sugar. Maybe that is because they did not want to do anything which the English people were doing, so they created their own way of drinking tea, which is the right way, of course, in many cases. The Chinese and the Japanese do not really drink tea with milk and sugar. So there's a lot of this interesting anecdotes and stories about the French way of drinking tea and what happened in France. And then, of course, during the 1950s, there was a insurgence of tea. Tea became very popular in France, in Paris particularly. Now, if you go to Paris, you will see that so many tea rooms are there, and they have some very exotic teas. They like that. They like lighter teas, not like the dark, heavy teas as the English people prefer. They have more lighter teas, and tea now is a very big thing in France. In fact, in many cases, they are replacing good, fine tea with wine, primarily for the health purposes. So, yep, that's kind of it. More story next week.